Good afternoon and welcome to the Veteran Lived Experience Series podcast, brought to you by the Veterans Health and Wellness Foundation. My name is Dr. Evelyn Lewis and I serve as the president and chair of the organization. Today's conversation speaks to courage, history, and the power of legacy. I was in the DMV this week for the presentation of the Congressional Gold Medal to the 6th AAA Central Postal Directory Battalion. If you don't know, the 6th AAA was the only all-black, all-female battalion deployed overseas during World War II. In this premiere episode of the Veteran Lived Experience podcast, I sat down with Colonel retired Edna Cummings several weeks ago and we talked about her remarkable Army career, the importance of family, and her unwavering commitment to honoring the legacy of 6th AAA. Welcome and thank you so much for agreeing to come tonight and spend some time with us. We know you as a retired Army veteran. As I mentioned, you're an advocate, an author, one of the driving forces, big driving forces behind the recognition of 6th AAA, which was the first and only Black women's Army Corps unit to be deployed during World War II. So again, welcome. And before we dive into 6th AAA, because I want to really have a little bit of a thorough discussion around that, before we dive into that, I want to talk a little bit about your ongoing commitment to veterans, their families, et cetera. Again, you're a retired colonel, so you spent a number of years on active duty, but you're continuing that service after the fact, after transitioning. And so what's the driver behind that for you?
The driver for my continuation of service, I was born with an ID card. So that's all I've known since day one. My father was in the Army. He's retired. And he served in World War II occupation force. And so many of my family members served in World War II. So there's a legacy of service on active duty and afterwards, because growing up in the military family, military community, there's no shortage of work. So I like to tell people that I joined the family business, so it just comes natural, I suppose.
Well, you served on a number of different boards, like ASU Foundation Board. You established a Warrior Fund. You currently serve as a military advisor, board member for History Makers. So as you spoke a little bit about that drive to continue to give back to the community, you were also honored recently at the Veterans Health and Wellness Foundation's gala. What did that mean to you?
In the Army, there's something called the element of surprise. It totally caught me off guard. And once I learned about the Veteran Wellness Foundation, I just thought about the power of storytelling as a way to heal, because I have written quite a few articles and also a book that we'll talk some more about later. But just reflecting back, and once I write the story or finish a book, like, wow, I really did come through a lot, and I'm still here. And just, I think it's empowering, it's therapeutic. And even if you just share a story for your own self, for your family, I think there is a therapeutic and redeeming quality, because it makes you lighten up on yourself a little bit, because that human factor comes in, that you make mistakes, you do some great things, and through it all, you're still here.
Can you share a little bit about your own personal journey, active duty military, your family? You mentioned a little bit about that as we got started. What it was like to transition from active service to veteran status, and then what was it that sort of drove you to want to tell this story?
My first transition was being from military family member to someone on active duty myself, into a military member. So that was interesting. And then I married a fellow military member who's now deceased, so I was a military spouse. So just about every aspect of the military family and the community I've touched. And while I was on active duty, I don't recall ever reading anything about Black women who served during World War II. And I just happened to stumble upon the story probably 2015, 2016, and honestly what caught my attention was the commander of the 6th AAA was a black woman named Edna who said some things that she wished she wouldn't have had sometimes. And so there was a connection just because of the name. But during World War II, there were almost 7,000 black women on active duty, to include the nurses. So the 6888 is just a slice of that story. So once I started reading and learning about the 6888, those other stories of non-6888 members, the nurses who served overseas, as well as some of the civilian aides like the Black Donut Dollies. I didn't know the Red Cross had black women overseas working because the white women didn't work with the troops. So we had to have these Black Donut Dollies. So many stories, and I just got hooked. It just became addictive, and I just fell in love with that era and the time and what it represented for black women who served. And women of color in general. There were more than black women. There were women, Hispanic, Caribbean, Latina women. So.
And when you talk about these other women, Latinos, and et cetera, were their roles similar in terms of what you saw for black women who were serving during that period of time? Were they as discounted or, ignored or placed to the side as we were?
Well, it depends. With the women from Puerto Rico, that's the demographic that's most represented in terms of Latina women. And it depended on their skin color, because race is a social construct. The color of your skin and what it represents is a social construct. So when the women came from Puerto Rico to the U.S., it depended on their skin tone. Okay. So if they were dark enough, and some of them came over in the summertime, had a tan, they were assigned to the black unit. One woman was, her dad was black, her mom was from Mexico. So they gave her a choice. Do you want to serve with the black unit or white unit? So that's a hard question, because it all depended on how they were socialized or what they chose. But the ones who chose to join a black unit definitely experienced some of the same challenges as black women, and even more so because one woman I spoke with, and in her interview she mentioned that she was never black enough or she was never white enough, so she just never knew where she belonged. Although she identified as black, there was some challenges even with that, because they challenged her. You had a choice. Why did you join us? Your life could have been so much better. So it all depends.
Well, what do you think the story of 6888? What do you think is the significance of that, both socially in American history as well as in military history?
Well, I'll start socially, because the 6888, I like to think of it as a true underdog story. And they're being recognized not because they're black women, primarily because they saw the military's male and morale problem in Europe during World War II. The Congressional Gold Medal, that made the story compelling. And when I shared that story, that's something that I emphasize. Yes, there were black women, but that was secondary to the mission. And speaking with several of these women, they worked together and were so proud to have the opportunity to serve and to help the troops. So it was a common mission. And many of them said, I asked, how did you serve under those circumstances? And just consistently, it was like, we didn't worry about that. We had a job to do. And so that's something about the military, the camaraderie and the sense of purpose. The mission is so clear. Although they were segregated by gender primarily and then race, but the mission was more important, because one thing we all know as veterans, a bullet, a weapon knows no color, and all blood is red. So when it's all said and done. So that's the attitude these women had that just, I was so fascinated by, their story. Not only 6888, but just some of the 6888 veterans from that era I spoke to. They're all saying the same thing. Yes, it was hard. Yes, we were discriminated against because of gender and race, but we had a bigger job to do.
It's interesting, that word mission and its connotation. I often say to people, when I retired, went to work in industry for a bit, And we had cross-functional teams and those kinds of things. And you get involved, you get a project. And so, the only work I had was 25 years in the military. So that was my orientation. So my learning curve was, extremely steep. And in talking with folks who were on those teams, they get suspicious when you jumped in to get the job done. Once you found out what it was you were supposed to be doing, let's get it done. But they always had in the back of their minds, why are you, sort of jumping in to get this? It was like, what are you talking about? I looked at that as the mission. Had nothing to do with anything
That's right.
else. We were a team, this is the mission, we need to go get this accomplished. And I think when we talk about, as you were saying there about the 6888 as well as others, that mission piece and their commitment to getting the work done was what took over, and in spite of all of the other obstacles that were there. So when you talk about these obstacles that they faced, what are some of the lessons from their stories that you think remain relevant today, both in the military and in society in general?
Well, some of the lessons from the 6888, I think the most important one for me is resilience. How can you function in an environment and you are the underdog? You're not expected to perform well. You're not expected to be successful by the traditional definition of success, meaning getting the job done. So that resilience, it determines on the individual, because what's resilient for one person is not necessarily the same for the other. You can have two people in similar situations, they respond differently. But for the 6888, they managed to pull together, and that's the first lesson. Then leadership. What few people talk about, and what I learned in my research, when women joined World War II to support primarily the Army, and the Army Air Corps was one, they had to have high school diplomas, and the men did not. So just because of the higher standard women had to meet, you had the best in the nation. I mean, the literacy levels post-Depression, World War II, were less than 50%, maybe even 60%. That's high school diploma. And so because of the education, 85% of the 6888 had college degrees, former school teachers. So they were some of the best and brightest in the nation. And then the commander was very educated, just gifted. She was in graduate school when she, at 26 years old, she was in graduate school at Ohio State when she assumed command of the 6888. And she was the first black woman to receive her commission in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps in 1942. Not because of merit, because her name started with an A. That's why she was the first. But that being said, it's just, she had troop experience.
Okay.
She understood the obstacles. And so just like we do in the military, we task organize based on talents. Not all of the women in the 6888 were postal clerks or mail clerks, because when they went overseas, they had to set up a small city or garrison. So they had to get themselves ready and prepared to tackle this mail. Our documentary and the movie does a great job in showing that obstacle, mail backlog since prior to D-Day.
Yes.
And it was overwhelming. And so the discipline, the military discipline, in a tough situation, remain calm, conduct that mission analysis, rely on the talent of your team, manage that talent. And so all of those requirements and skills and approaches are still very relevant when we're faced with obstacles. First thing, just breathe. And you don't back away from it. In the movie, I think, Kerry Washington says, okay, we have a job to do. The troops are relying on us, expecting us to perform. No one expects for us to succeed. So you don't hide behind the obstacles. You don't make the troops think everything is okay, we're going to be fine. No, the only way that we're going to be fine is that we work together. It's hard. People expect for us to fail, but let's figure this out together. And so that's the message, the leadership, and not backing down from the challenge and not masking it and saying, oh, this is easy, we can get it done. No, it's hard because other units, white male units, had tried to clear that male backlog, but they all had failed. And so the 6888 would love the recognition, yes, because they were black women, yes, because they were women, but they got the job done when no one else could.
Yeah, I agree with you. Both the documentary and the movie did a really good job of demonstrating that and driving that part of the story home, which I think is very important. The other thing, so with that being applicable, as you were talking about, to us today, you know, looking at the challenge, being resilient, working towards a mission, et cetera, with the current transition in our leadership and the things that we're seeing evolving, happening all at once, et cetera, particularly around DE&I. So as we think about 6888, bringing it to the forefront, exposing more folks to it, what do you think are some of the challenges that will be met in terms of continuing to get that story and message out? Because any wording, any association with that term, or actually how it relates to us, has been sort of downplayed or beginning to want to be wiped out. So how can we still utilize that to facilitate the kinds of things that we talked about with the challenges that we're going to definitely be meeting here?
I think, yes, it is challenging, but many of us of a certain age have been here before, so this is nothing new. And it's history repeating itself because there is a fear of the unknown. And when fear results, I think, from not being familiar of the unknown, and with DEI and all people of various backgrounds, is fear of the unknown. So I think it's a great opportunity, number one, for communities to share their own story and keep sharing the story, and in the workplace and environments where it's questioned, fall back on what we've always done. Just be the best version of yourself and neutralize the threat.
That's a good way to put it.
So I just go to the military just because when I came on active duty, I faced the exact same challenges that Charity Adams, and what the movie showed the general harassing her and taunting her. And when she said, over my dead body. But in reality, the true story, he came back to her and says, you taught me something. I've never experienced anyone like you. I've never worked around anyone like you. So thank you. And the exact same thing happened to me when I came on active duty. I've had people, males and females, just because being 22, 23 years old out of college in the Army is hard as an officer. So the expectation as a second lieutenant or an an 01, it is challenging. So people want to see what you're made of. And I just think about how do I navigate? To be very clear, you show up and you show out. You get the job done. You get the job done and earn respect. And I've received several apologies from my white male peers and some women, because there were men who didn't think women belonged then in World War II, and when I came in, didn't think women belonged. They couldn't understand why would any woman want to join the military. So you're challenging the status quo. Women of all races have, by joining the military, challenge that. So by challenging the status quo just by your presence, but when you craft those solutions, You don't fall out of the runs. You prove yourself physically and mentally, and we cannot run to the pitfall of zero tolerance, but that's the way it feels, that we cannot make a mistake. Because our mistakes, if you're the underdog, if you are underrepresented, I call it the low end of the food chain where you get gobbled up, you don't get that second chance.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's just the harsh reality. However, at the end of the day, if you can look yourself in the mirror and says, hey, you know what? I gave 100%. And that's what everyone should do when you show up. And it really neutralizes the threat. And I'll just use that military term or the attitude, put it in civilian terms. But that's what's being threatened, that you are showing up because you are a DEI hire. Not because you're competent, not because you're the best, just because you check a box. So what if you did check a box? That's getting there, but you got to stay there.
Yeah.
And so I just think, first of all, it is unfortunate that we are back here again, but I think it's a great opportunity to, number one, expand these stories within the community, within our own community, because now I think people are sharing more stories because we have those platforms and opportunities to do so. So it may not be allowed in certain spaces, but in some spaces they still are.
Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Edna W. Cummings, United States Army retired and author of A Soldier's Life, A Black Woman's Rise from the Army Brackets 666 champion.
Mr. Speaker, our Senate and House co-sponsors, members of Congress, families, distinguished guests, I am more than honored to be with you today to present the 6888 with our nation's highest civilian award, the long-awaited, much sought-after Congressional Gold Medal.
So one of the things that that is very complimentary, to say the least, about 6888 is that they were the recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor in 2022. And so how significant was that in terms of recognizing their legacy? And for you, what was it like being a part of why that happened?
Well, the significance of the 6888, it really is one of incredible historical significance, because the first Congressional Gold Medal, first of all, the Congressional Gold Medal is not a military award. It's a civilian award. It's law. It's actually law. And it requires the president to sign legislation. And in order for a bill to become a law, we need 2/3 majority of both chambers. That means Congress has to agree that these individuals made an impact on our nation. And so General George Washington was the first recipient of the Congressional Gold Medal, not President George Washington, General George Washington in 1776. And since then, less than 200 individuals or institutions have been awarded the nation's highest civilian honor, signed by the president. And so that says volumes, and I like to say that the 6888 brought the nation together. They got a job done that nobody else could. They solved the military's male morale problem during World War II and restored reliable mail operations. The Army is in charge of mail overseas when troops are deployed. So I'm glad that the Army got this recognition. And they were really the only military women's unit who were serving in full military status, eligible for benefits. The Hello Girls, World War I, just received the Congressional Gold Medal. They didn't get veteran status in 1977 because when they came back from World War I, the Army said they were never soldiers, even though they signed enlistment papers. The Women's Air Service pilots, those were volunteers. So the 6888, the only Women's Army Corps unit, the first, and they received this honor, less than 200 since 1776, signed by the president. And signing legislation is remarkable because of the probably 10 to 15,000 pieces of resolutions and bills that hit Congress every year that they cannot agree on, less than 5%, get passed and signed by the president. So just for the nation to come together, the 688, I think, just embodies of what it means, to neutralize an environment based on performance, focus on the mission, and to be respected. So that's, at the end of the day, that's what we all want, is to be respected for our talents and abilities, even though it's decades later. I think this is such a good news story, and the president also signed 2 other pieces of legislation for the 6888, 2 post offices. One for Miss Indiana Hunt Martin in Buffalo, and one for Millie Dunn Vesey in Raleigh. So we have 3 pieces of legislation where the 6888 has brought our nation together and says, hey, we agree these women who happen to be black did something that made our nation better. It helped us win the war. So that's the impact for me.
So it must have, how should we say, warmed your heart and what have you to have actually been a prominent part of getting that done.
Yes, I mean, I look at it like everybody, part of our grassroots effort. We all carried a baton for the 6888, and we worked together as we were in this, as we are in, because I don't think it's over, the 6888. It's a marathon now. It's a marathon. We started out with the monument, we did the documentary, and Senator Jerry Moran from Kansas, and I would like to take a moment to just extend my condolences to the members who lost their lives coming on that flight from Kansas. Yes. And Senator Jerry Moran was my lead sponsor. And so that's something I don't think people know, Republican, but he embraced the story so much since early 2018. And so when I contacted his staff, because he worked with us, he did a Senate resolution for the monument. But no one was paying attention, when no one was talking about the 6888, Senator Moran from Kansas did a Senate resolution to honor the 6888 and the 6888 monument that's in Buffalo Soldier Park at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, home of the 10th Cavalry from the Buffalo Soldiers. So it's just like there's so many, we're so connected in ways that I don't think the public understands. And I could go on and on about that. But that's where it started. In 2018, we did the monument, did the documentary. Again, Senator Moran helped us get the meritorious unit accommodation for the 6888. The bill passed the Senate twice before it passed the House through his staff's effort. And then other people like, whoa, what are you all doing? Because we had someone, the executive producer of the documentary, Jim Theris, and we have a musical by Blair Underwood, 6888, the musical that's in development. And of course, Fort Gregg Adams, Fort Lee. So you never know who's paying attention. There have been several books now written about the 6888.
Yeah, I saw
right, of course, the movie. So that's another lesson learned for me. When you're pulling people together, it's a common purpose, common goal. It's amazing what veterans can do, because veterans actually were the ones who carried the story of the 6888, these various organizations. So it's truly a grassroots effort.
Well, it's tremendous what's happening.
Yes.
And I think we even have far more to accomplish and gain from it, because going from very few people really even knowing to now what we're seeing, like you mentioned, there are numerous books out, the movies out, the documentary, and things just keep growing and growing and growing. And as we do that, more people become aware. And they have to become aware before they can begin to understand all of the pieces to it. So I think highlighting the awareness, that groundswell that you are such a huge part of creating is really going to take us much further down the line than where we are now.
Right, and unfortunately, the 6888 has been, I've had some events canceled. And I don't think it's because of a 6888, but just for the special observances. But the 6888 goes far beyond DEI. It talks about logistics, how logistics problems were solved, and that was the core of what we were talking about. How did this group solve a major logistics problem during World War II? And when we started out, we knew that we probably confined our, grassroots team. Says, okay, we no one to probably care. We can do Black History Month, Women's History Month, and then the story started to grow where we were mainstream because this is a World War II story, just like several other units of color. I mean, you have the Band of Brothers that really, but this is like a Band of Sisters, similar. You have the Navajo Code Talkers. And just so many various groups, the Rangers, the Ghost Army, these units, these various elements, everyone had a mission, and everybody seems like it's getting delayed gratification. So it's not just the 6888 that is receiving delayed honors and delayed, gratification. So there are a lot of, white male units that didn't get their just due as well. And so I think we're just playing catch up with honoring our heroes. And it's just unfortunate that they are being pigeonholed.
It was interesting when you were talking about, the 6888, but it was more about logistics and solving the issue and the problem, et cetera. As the head of the Veterans Health and Wellness Foundation, I think of how all of this aligns with health and wellness. And so when you talk about those mounds and mounds and mounds of mail that was just hanging out in these buildings, and what it did to the morale of both the family and those fighting, you have to take a second to contemplate what would have happened if that had failed, because it was key to the morale of those who were fighting in that war. And morale, if you're not, together in that way, if you're wondering what's going on here and you're distracted over here, the outcome could have been significantly different.
Right. I refer to it as a force multiplier. It's one of those elements in wartime that you plan for logistics, the basics, food, clothing, shelter, and of course military pay. But you take care of the basics, and morale is something that you have to maintain. And keep in mind, Charity Adams had to maintain the morale of her own troops, and they did that through sports teams, entertainment teams, and R&R, rest and relaxation or recreation. And then she had to be concerned about the morale of the troops that she was serving. So at 26 years old, that was a lot. And if the male backlog had continued, one could speculate with plummeting morale. This is like you wake up, you don't feel like going to work. You don't show up.
That's right.
So, and then I think something else is that political element, support for the war. If families aren't hearing from their loved ones, how can we support a war and we don't know what the heck is going on? So I think that part wasn't, it's alluded to just in terms of the context of the impact that the 6888 made, restoring that vital communication. So that's what the 6888 did. Reliable mail operations, which, basically, vital communication for the troops and their loved ones.
Absolutely. That was a bridge that had to be, or gap, shall I say, that had to be closed. So as we've talked about that, we're not going to definitely leave that, but I want to focus a little bit more on a book that you recently released, A Soldier's Life, A Black Woman's Rise from Army Brat to 6888 Champion. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey?
That journey started before I knew about the 6888. Actually, I had written the book as a fictionalized version of my life because I just sat down. I was tired of the Beltway traffic, post-retirement, like we all do. We get jobs, and traffic in the D.C. area is hard. So I just thought I'd give it a go. What if I could rewrite my life? So I did all the research, and I'd written the fictionalized version of my life and set it aside. And that was probably 2016. And then when I started with the 6888 around 2020, a close friend of mine who we served together, General Mary Kay Eder, who had just completed a book, Girls Who Stepped Out of Line, changed the course of World War II. And so she reached out to me and says, hey, can you help me write this chapter on Charity Adams? Because she included a series of women who made an impact in World War II, civilian and military women. And she said, what's your story? And she's written several books. And I'm like, she said, I know you have it written. And so we talked, and my working title was The Odds Ain't Good. That was, the publisher didn't like that, but that was the working title because when I stepped back and looked at the fictionalized version of my life, when I started college, less than 10% of African Americans were in college. When I made 06, less than 5% of officers in the Army, regardless of race or gender, less than 5% of officers made 06. And then when we got the Congressional Gold Medal, that was for that legislative session of Congress, probably less than, it was, well, the first time was less than 3% because it was the 116th Congress, COVID, so a lot was going on. And so I just kind of portioned my life out in those, I'm like, wow, I said, yeah. And so that was my motivation for writing the book. Growing up on a military base, I didn't realize how much of a unique aspect that was until I went to college at Appalachian State in Boone. And I didn't do a campus visit. I just visited because I liked the pictures. There was beautiful trees. And I went to some other colleges on college visits. I just didn't like it. So I'm like, all right, black and gold, my favorite team, Pittsburgh Steelers. I was in love with Franco Harris, And so that's how I chose Appalachian. And I joined that ROTC program. And that was, I think, maybe the second year women could join ROTC. And my dad objected. But when I told him that I could be an officer, he calmed down a little bit because writing the book and doing the research, I now understand because of the stigma, not just of black women, of all women who were in the military in the 40s. I mean, that was something that was not a traditional role for a woman.
Indeed.
But these women, again, were there to release a man for combat. And then on the civilian front, we had Rosie the Riveters, and there were more than 600,000 black Rosies, actually. So many of these stories. But anyway, as I started doing the research, because to write the fictionalized version to make it plausible, I did a lot of research. Just, my time overseas, I was stationed in Korea, went to DMZ, Parmesan quite a bit for several reasons. And then just becoming a defense contractor, not a Beltway bandit, but a Parkway patriot. I learned
I like that.
I learned a lot about the business of the military and defense industry and federal industry. And so I just started pulling it all together, and that's how A Soldier's Life, because it is. And that title has been used, I saw in other books, but I don't recall seeing anything that really walked through a series of wars, World War II, Vietnam War, Korean War, and I experienced that in some form by being stationed overseas. My father was in Korean War. I was stationed in Korea. So just so much interesting aspects about women in service and about my father's service that I just really took the time to research. And after I just had that time to research my father's service, I was just so impressed that I hadn't done it with what he'd done, because he was World War II occupation force in Italy, and stationed at Fort Bragg. Well, then Fort Bragg is now Fort Liberty, and he was with the advisory group in Vietnam and got wounded 90 days in country. And then I just started piecing all this together. And, reading the telegrams and just a lot of his documents, I almost stopped and started to write about him. But just to, I guess, from a military brat, I learned more about his service and the impact on my life and then how that gave me a platform to organize a grassroots effort for the 688 and using a lot of skills I learned in the military, because I use the term, neutralize, and not necessarily a threat, but I should have probably said an attitude. A negative attitude is probably more appropriate, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to, with the attack on DEI, says, wait, I've met every standard that you've met, but because of my gender and skin color, I am perceived as less than. So I think meeting the standards, and I would say that most people who are underrepresented have had to work twice as hard for half the respect.
As you wrote that story, and doing the research that you were doing, even though it was a fictionalized version, were there any particular stories or pieces that were difficult or more emotional than some of the others as you were putting that story together?
I think the emotional part was with the death of my husband. That was totally unexpected. He was the first African American male to be assigned on the DMZ at Parmesan, and that's in 1976. His counterpart was killed by the North Koreans because they were on the tree clearing mission, and something went wrong, and they had axes, and so the North Koreans attacked them and killed his counterpart, and I believe it was 2 other soldiers got killed. And so 4 or 5 years later, he assumes that job. And so we were dating in Korea. I was in Uijeonbu. He was in Parmesan. And we came back, and he got very sick. And his disease was so rare, it was something called light chain disease. It was just watching him die, going from a 6'2", 185, 200-pound airborne infantry ranger below the zone, all of the brass and accoutrements that comes with someone who's just doing well. But I think the hardest part was just the realizing that acceptance that death is going to happen, because people like, you're a good person, God is not going to let this happen. And so that was hard, because I grew up, God is not going to put more on you than you can bear. And so I negate that, because veteran suicide rates and depression shows that, you cannot bear everything that life puts on you. And so when that happens, you need to find a way to regroup, refocus. And so I just talk about the therapeutic value actually of work and working out and exercising and just kind of coming through a very dark time. So that, once I read that, it was, I went through a lot of emotions, and I was like, whew, I really did that. And then I had, 2 small children, single parent, so.
Gave you a chance to breathe a bit
exactly.
when doing that.
Yeah, it does.
As we say, when all else is, just breathe.
But that happened 30 years ago. So, but just to kind of really put it out. So even regardless of when it happens, I think that's some value in itself.
Yeah. You heard me mention about the Veteran Health and Wellness Foundation and sort of, the things that we do. We kind of try to have this holistic approach. You mentioned a little bit about veteran suicide and what those levels are like. And so as we do our work, we focus on kind of all of that, whether it's mental, behavioral health, physical conditions, chronic conditions. All of that plays a role in veteran health. And so as we sort of think a little bit about the work that you've done, how do you think maybe the legacy of 6888 reflects sort of that importance of holistic support for service members and their families, particularly when you talk about, one of your major audience groups is veterans and the family?
Well, with the 6888 and veteran wellness, it was interesting speaking with a lot of the women. A lot of them did use the GI Bill. Because they realized they didn't talk much about the service for a lot of reasons. One, the stigma, of course, of being a woman. And then veterans don't talk about their service. Just in general terms, veterans, because it's hard for me to talk to a non-veteran about going to the DMZ when I was in Korea and doing what I did, to support my time over there or other experiences. So number one, finding that sense of community. We brought a community together. That's the first thing. Secondly, it's just capturing your legacy, because veteran stories are so compelling, and every veteran has one. And that's one thing about the military in terms of the mission. You look at your assignment, we call it that, table of organizations or modified table of organizations, whatever the term is now. You are there for a purpose. And as you grow, whether it's 2 years or 20 years, there's something you did to make an impact. And it's something that you've learned. And it's something you should share with your families. Because the families now with the 6888, the 6888 has impacted, families of all races, and men and women, because we are teaching them about their family members. And I feel like I've created a group of history buffs now, because every day I'm just getting emails and stories that people are now talking to their family members and sharing the stories
And getting more of their own.
that's right. And so that's helpful. And I think that's therapeutic, and it's a way to bring people together as well, because we just have our group of 6888 family members. We actually went on a tour to Europe in 2023 with Stephen Ambrose Tours. I was a tour historian, and we're going again this year in October. The Stephen Ambrose Tours. I mean, it's the Legacy Tour. We start in Scotland. And then we go to England and Rouen, France, Normandy, Paris. Yeah, somebody has to do it. So
Somebody has to do it.
So it's excellent. It's an excellent way to bond, and so I just feel like we're getting a new generation of history nerds, which I just absolutely love.
Well, before I wrap up, or before we end, one of the things that we always like to talk a little bit about and hear a bit of a personal story around is if you could recall a time when you were deployed and you missed being home during the holidays.
Well, deployed or just away from home, because military moving every 2 to 3 years. We usually get sometimes 30 days of leave, and sometimes you just cannot make it for Thanksgiving and Christmas, so you pick one. And what was interesting, a group of us would just come together and make our own holidays, so that's so important in terms of establishing that sense of community. And one in particular, I remember I was at Fort Rucker. Now the name has been changed, but and we would just get together, and someone would kind of like potluck. All right, I made sweet potato pies using my mom's recipe, and so we all just have I can't remember Thanksgiving or Christmas, but just to restore that sense of home or something that's familiar or that comfort. And sometimes we didn't do anything. We were just kind of quiet.
Still.
And so, it's interesting now, whenever possible, my parents are in their 90s, I try to make it back for the holidays. It's just something, no matter what, I feel guilty if I don't go home for the holidays, or, we'll do a holiday vacation when they could travel. So, yeah, those are things that I remember just by being in the military. And some friends, there's something about veterans I've served with. I may not have spoken with them for decades, but we can have a conversation for 2 or 3 hours and pick up where we left off, like time is frozen. And, we can, share stories because of some of those moments that we had together where we were on deployment or on a mission someplace, and we can reflect and just kind of.
Yeah, I often will say that too with friends when we're talking about any number of different things. I said, my being in the military has afforded me friendships that that you can't even define. I said I could drive across country and never have to stay in a hotel.
Oh, wow.
Never have to stay in a hotel. Because again, we're here, we're there, and because of knowing folks, it affords us that ability to do a lot of that. That's kind of one of my things, is keeping in touch with people. I still keep in touch with people I went to kindergarten with. And so for those I serve with, is a different kind of bond with veterans in the work that we've done together. So, but anyway, all I can say is thank you.
Oh, well, thank you.
This was a very enlightening conversation, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with others so that they can hear the messages that are in there, whether we're talking about 6888 in and of itself, or a soldier's life and how those two interact and interconnect with each other. And hopefully the bigger message of understanding what sharing and continuing to tell those stories can do for us in terms of our communities and helping us move forward. So again, thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing more as we move through this year.
I appreciate that, because for me this is more than history, it's now my heritage. And that's a lot stronger, and I've just learned so much about myself, actually, just continue to grow and develop. It's a lifelong learner, so I appreciate you giving a voice to me and to this story and just amplifying it, so thank you.
You're welcome. We'll continue to do that, and we'll probably ask you for some of that links to that trip that you're going to be doing in October, so we can put that message out for folks too who might be interested. Throughout our conversation, we reflected on sisterhood, service, and the power of storytelling to elevate and preserve our veteran voice community. For more information on the foundation, please visit us at www.myvhwf.org. I'd also like to offer my personal thanks to Colonel Retired Edna Cummings for her work in heightening the awareness of the 6888 and its legacy.